Thank you for joining me for this series of lessons taken from the book of Philippians. I've entitled the series, Go for the Win, because in Jesus Christ we've called to be winners. We're called to be victorious, not because of what we do for ourselves, but rather what we permit God to do for us and through us in Jesus Christ. We need to remember that we are part of God's great plan. And if we are in Christ, we are assured of victory. This week, I've entitled the lesson, God Plays Chess, Not Dice, taken from Philippians 1:12 through 17. I took this title from a statement famously made by Albert Einstein, where he said, "I do not believe that God plays dice with the cosmos." And so it is if we believe that God is there, that God is in control, that He is the Almighty, that He has a plan. We have an assurance. And this assurance comes to us because of our belief in providence. The term providence doesn't resonate with us quite as well as the very simple statement of the old spiritual. He's got the whole world in His hands. That simple refrain, which came out of the crucible of the experience of American slavery, where those who were so oppressed and so mistreated were able to look to God and to recognize that even in that setting, God was in control. So it is in our lives that we recognize that God is in control. There is nothing that can happen to us that is greater than God. We must make sure that we are true to what God has revealed to us about His work. So often, we look at our lives and we try to explain it all, but we must recognize that God is greater than we can understand. On that basis, we have to be careful. We have to be careful not to ascribe to God things that certainly do not fit. God is not the source of evil. God is not the source of anything malicious or bad. On the other hand, we've got to remember that God is in control, as He has revealed Himself to be. Romans 8:28, Paul says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose." Now, whatever else we may say about free will and about things that happen, we've got to remember God is not caught by surprise. God is not caught off guard. God does not let anything fall through the cracks. In all things, God is able to work for good. Now, He does not really say that all things will be good. All things here is restricted. In all things, God works together for good for those who love Him. Not everyone is going to receive every blessing. The grace of God is conditioned upon being in Christ. But for those who are in Christ, for those who belong to God, even the hard things of life produce good. We think back of the Old Testament and remember the story of Joseph, who was mistreated by his brothers, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. But God is greater than the negative things. Remember what Joseph said to his brothers, Genesis 50, verse 20. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." The brothers of Joseph had sold him into slavery. He had been mistreated, but he rose to be second in Egypt, just behind Pharaoh himself. And in doing this, God's people, his brothers and their families, would all be preserved through a time of famine. His brothers had meant it for evil, but God was able to use it not only for Joseph's good, but for the good of them all. God is greater than the hard things of life. Especially in this time of pandemic, we need to remember that Our lives, while they are different than we would have imagined a year ago, our lives are still in the hands of God, and God is greater than the adversity we face. Going back to the book of Philippians, we remember that the Apostle Paul wrote the book while he was imprisoned in Rome. And to be imprisoned, to be shackled to a Roman centurion under house arrest, such a humiliating and difficult time. And yet Paul tells us, Philippians 1 verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. First of all, notice the priority. The advancement of the good news of Jesus Christ was more important to Paul than his personal comfort. And he wanted the church in Philippi to know that even though he was facing adversity, it was advancing the gospel. Verse 13, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Being a prisoner in Rome gave Paul an opportunity that he otherwise would not have had. And through that, he was able to share the good news within the very imperial guard. Caesar's own household was being influenced by the good news because of Paul's imprisonment. I think about people who've gone through times of adversity, and yet, even in their adversity, they were able to find opportunities for sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. So it was with the Apostle Paul. He serves as an example for us. And we, thousands of years later, can draw strength from this example. His imprisonment blesses us because it shows us the good that can be done, even in harsh circumstances. We need to remember the big picture. While we ourselves may be facing temporary adversity, we are part of God's grand plan. Just like a game of chess, the pieces move across the board, and individual pieces may be at a disadvantage at times. But the broad scope is still moving forward. So it is in our lives. Our inconveniences and hardships may be used by God to bring about a greater blessing, not only for us, but for those around us. Verse 14, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. The big picture of God's work in this world involves all of his people, not just me or you. And because it's not all about me, I shouldn't be so focused on how I feel at a particular moment. But rather, in faith, looking to God, I should have confidence that he knows what he is doing. And he is at work in my life, even as he was at work in the life of the Apostle Paul, to bring about good. Because of Paul's example, most of his brothers became confident and were more bold to speak without fear. They saw that Paul was imprisoned because of the gospel, and they were able to say, if Paul could face this, I can face it too. What's the worst that can happen? Well, I can end up like Paul. And if Paul is able, in a noble and majestic way, to enter into the will of God, so I should let the Lord's will be done in my life. I need to be faithful. Verse 15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Individual responsibility. Some used Paul's situation for a selfish advantage. They preached Christ out of rivalry, out of hatred of Paul, but others were preaching out of goodwill. Notice that Paul cannot control the choices other people make. In our own lives, we need to trust God, and we need to be faithful, and recognize that some people will follow the right course and others will not. We can't do anything about their choices, but we can make sure we are proceeding as we ought. Verse 16, the latters do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for defense of the gospel. Those who were preaching the gospel out of love were doing so because of their love of God, because of their love for the Apostle Paul. Love is the great motivation for us. The love of Christ that has been revealed to us draws us to the Lord, and we share that love with those around us. There are those who did not. Verse 17, the former proclaimed Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. This is almost to the point of being comic. There's the Apostle Paul, chained to a Roman soldier in his rented house, under house arrest, not free to go about as he would please. And these false Christians, these narrow people, wanting to inflict pain on Paul, go out and preach Christ. Paul's not able to go about preaching as he normally would. He was constrained to his house. And these hateful Christians went out and in a selfish way preached Christ in order to get at Paul. It's comic because, of course, the important thing was Christ was being preached, and that's all Paul cared about. He did not care that those people had freedom that he did not have. He saw the bigger picture, and he was the bigger man. We need to remember, God has the whole world in his hands. We can't make decisions for other people, but we ourselves can resolve to be faithful. And in faith, we can look to the Lord and recognize that he is able, even in times of great adversity, to bring about an advancement of his kingdom. He has told us that victory is ours in Jesus Christ. We need to go for the win. We need to be all in for Jesus. We need to recognize that God is in control. We must be faithful, but he is the one who will provide the victory. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will pick up here next week.